Chapter 1. The air in the carriage was a sheath of frosted velvet, pressing the silence into Alara's lungs until her chest ached. She sat with her spine a stiff, desperate line against the leather, the iron grip of the covens packed around her throat tighter than the silk scarf she wore. Outside, the moon was a splinter of bone hooked on the skeletal branches of an ancient, unforgiving forest, its light filtering into the carriage only as a suggestion of pewter and shadow. She was 17, mute by choice since the day the prophetess was burned in the town square, and now she was chattel, a debt paid to the Astria family, the most ancient and reviled of the bloodline houses, masters of the desolate northern territories where the sunlight feared to tread. Her blood, they had been assured, was special, a word that had always sounded like a pronouncement of death in her ears. The carriage lurched, wheels grinding over gravel, and the immense, oppressive silhouette of the House of Mourning, the Astria Manor, finally dominated the view. It was not a home. It was a mausoleum of black marble and slate, all jutting angles and stained glass windows that seemed less like panes and more like watchful, predatory eyes. Loneliness, Alara knew, was not just a feeling here. It was the atmosphere. The manor doors, carved with forgotten sigils and crowned with gargoyles whose stone faces dripped with perpetually frozen rain, were opened by a man who was not a man. He was tall, impossibly still, with skin the color of polished Carrara marble, and eyes that held the frightening liquid depth of midnight reservoirs. This was Lord Valen Astria, the master of the house, the architect of the pact, and the source of the profound, tense quiet that suffocated the air. His gaze, devoid of warmth or judgment, passed over her like a current of ice. He wore a coat of black velvet that absorbed all light, and his demeanor was one of ancient, unbearable guilt, etched into the sharp lines of his beautiful, terrible face. He was the burdened male, the one rumored to have protected the human line for centuries out of self-loathing for his own immortal nature. He did not speak to her, but his internal voice, a soundless thunder of melancholy and high-stakes contemplation, seemed to echo in the hollows of the enormous foyer. Another debt, another innocent tethered to my curse. The transfer was executed in the cold, cavernous library, a chamber smelling of dust, old parchment, and the faint, metallic scent that always clung to his kind. Valen stood by a massive stone fireplace where a meager, melancholy flame clawed at the air. His steward, a precise and equally pale attendant, laid out the covenant, an ancient scroll sealed with a bloody wax imprint. Alara's human guardian, a fearful, mercenary figure, finished his duty quickly, his eyes refusing to meet the Lord's. When he was gone, the silence returned, heavier now, intimate and terrifying. Valen finally turned to her, his movement a devastating economy of grace. He was not merely beautiful. He was a relic of power, a guardian carved from cold marble, his posture fiercely protective, yet held in check by an invisible chain of profound self-control. He spoke, and his voice was a deep, resonant baritone, formal and carrying the weight of centuries. You are Alara of the Sunstone line. You are given to this house until the debt is paid, or until you are claimed by a power greater than the covenant. You will be housed. You will not be harmed. You will, however, be isolated. His eyes drifted to the silk scarf at her neck, and a flicker, a sharp, almost pained apprehension, crossed their liquid surface. I am told you will not speak. Alara only met his gaze, her conviction a stubborn, quiet flame. She would not speak the prophetic words locked behind her lips, not even for this ancient monster. She did not nod, did not flinch, only held the contact. In that moment, a subtle energy shifted. It was not the cold of the room, but a warmth rising from deep within her, a quiet, humming power that sought to anchor itself to something equally vast. Valen's perfect brow barely twitched, but the quiet hope in the tense air was suddenly hers alone. She felt his internal conflict, the burden of his race, the guilt of the covenant, fighting against a nascent protective curiosity for the silent human girl. The prophecy, long dismissed as fable, even among the bloodlines, now felt suddenly, dangerously real. Chapter 2. The room assigned to her was in the West Tower, the furthest from Valen's own chambers, yet somehow still within the orbit of his oppressive, protective presence. It was a chamber of stark contrast. Heavy, dark wood furniture against walls the color of aged ivory, and a single tall window that offered a devastating view of the moon-haunted forest. A fire struggled in the grate, casting dancing, nervous shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of the marble hearth. She was not a prisoner of bars, but a prisoner of silence and solitude, a deliberate isolation designed, she suspected, to prevent her from inadvertently triggering the very powers the coven feared. The stillness of the manor was absolute, broken only by the whisper of drafts and the occasional, almost imperceptible sound of Valen moving in the world below. The turning of a page, the faint, resonant chime of a clock marking a century of loneliness. Her first week was a slow-burn study in melancholy and atmosphere. Alara spent her days walking the permitted perimeter of her chamber and the adjacent, cold sunroom, always feeling the distant, omniscient pressure of Valen's awareness. He never watched her directly, never entered her chambers, yet she knew he was listening, his superhuman senses attuned to the faintest sound of her breath. She started to use her silence as a weapon and a shield. Instead of speaking, she drew. Charcoal became her voice. She sketched the manor, transforming its skeletal branches and watchful windows into a vast, Gothic labyrinth, a physical metaphor for Valen's own trapped, ancient heart. She drew the gargoyles, their faces frozen in sorrowful vigilance, and she drew the moon, the constant cold witness to her plight. One night, the silence was ruptured not by sound, but by scent, an intoxicating, terrifying scent, ozone, dust, and the rich copper tang of blood. She stiffened, the charcoal stick dropping from her numb fingers. It was not human blood, it was something deeper, older, and laced with a frightening electrical charge. It was the scent of a primal, supernatural threat that had breached the manor's ancient wards. She heard the sound then, sparse and purposeful, the near silent slide of metal, the impact of something heavy falling in the distant lower floors, followed by the terrifying liquid grace of Valen's movement. The deliberate rhythm of the manor's quiet was shattered by sudden, brutal action. She abandoned her post, driven not by curiosity, but by a fiercely protective internal command. She ran down the winding, cold staircase, her bare feet silent on the worn marble, her heart hammering out a frantic pagan rhythm against her ribs. She found him in the main hall. The scene was starkly illuminated by the struggling firelight. 3 figures, not vampires, but something far more feral, their forms blurring between human and spectral, clad in the dark, tattered armor of the Forsaken Covens. They were fast, but Valen was the definition of inhuman stillness and liquid grace. His movements were too quick to track, a blur of black velvet and striking alabaster, his fighting style a terrifying, purposeful dance. He moved with the power of a creature that had perfected its combat over millennia, each strike a brutal economy of force. When Alara arrived, Valen was already standing over the 3 fallen forms, not dead, but paralyzed, held in a state of suspended magical decay. Valen's left hand was pressed to a wound on his side, and the rich, dark blood was staining his velvet coat, a stark, sickening contrast. His head snapped toward her. His eyes, usually pools of melancholic midnight, were now burning gold, a sign of his unleashed power, and the look he gave her was one of pure, protective fury. "Go back, Alara!" His voice was a low, dangerous rumble, stripped of its usual formality, laced with the intoxicating scent of ancient languages and terminology. "This is not your concern. This is the old war." She ignored the command. She took 3 purposeful steps, kneeling beside him. Her hand, trembling, went to the wound. The moment her skin touched his, a massive, unexpected surge of energy, the quiet humming power she had felt on arrival, erupted from her, a wave of pure white heat. The blood on his coat steamed, and the gash, deep and clearly enchanted, knitted itself closed with impossible speed, leaving behind only the faintest silver scar. The paralyzed Forsaken recoiled, their bodies twitching in a silent, magical scream, their ancient enemies sensing the reawakening of a power they thought long extinguished. Vailin was entirely still, his golden eyes wide, staring at the silent girl whose blood had not been needed, whose touch had awakened the ancient legacy, transforming her from mere chattel into an anchor. Chapter 3. The aftermath of the attack settled over the House of Mourning like a heavy, cold shroud, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The isolation was gone, replaced by a tense, intimate vigilance. Vailin moved Alara's chambers from the distant West Tower to an apartment directly adjacent to his own private library, a move that placed her within his immediate sphere of fierce protection. The silence between them, once a barrier of propriety and distance, was now charged with the unspoken, overwhelming truth of her hidden power. He began his inquisition not with demands, but with high-value philosophical dialogue. He would find her in the library, always near the window where the moonlight was strongest, and he would watch her draw, his presence a heavy, beautiful weight in the room. He spoke only in formal, sparse lines, each word a piece of character backstory or world-changing information. "The power you wield is a mercy," he stated one night, his voice a low, resonant murmur against the sound of rain lashing the windows. "It is the echo of the first coven, the Solvats, those who could mend the damage of the old war. My kind, we break things, we are the reckoning, but you, Silent One, you are the repair." He spoke of his own burden, his ancient guilt, the self-hatred that fueled his self-imposed duty as a guardian of the human line. He was the most powerful of his house, yes, but also the most vulnerable to the moral conflict of his existence, mercy versus nature. Alara communicated only through her sketches, her conviction manifesting in sharp, deliberate charcoal strokes. She drew the scene of the attack, but instead of the brutal action, she drew the moment of the healing, the white light exploding from her hand, the silver scar forming on his marble skin. Beside it, she drew a complex diagram of ancient languages and terminology, a broken chain, and a woman holding a burning golden anchor. Her visual metaphor was clear. Her power was not just healing, it was binding. It was the opposite of his destructive nature, but also intrinsically linked to it. She was the one who could anchor him to his humanity, the one who could repair the deep, ancient damage within him. One evening, he presented her with a thin, leather-bound volume, its pages brittle with age and filled with elegant, faded script. It was a partial record of the Solvates, written in a language she could not read, but which resonated deep within her chest. "Your bloodline," he explained, his fingers brushing the spine, a rare, near-physical cue. "They were extinguished for their power, not by my house, but by the others, those who seek only destruction and the return of the ancient enemies. They feared the prophecy of the silent anchor." He paused, his focus on her eyes, seeking the answer she refused to give verbally. "The prophecy states that the anchor will be mute, that her silence is the lock on a power that can rewrite the covenants themselves. You do not speak because you know what you are locking away, do you?" Alara's face, usually a mask of quiet melancholy, shifted into an expression of intense, high-stakes vulnerability. She pushed the book away gently, taking the charcoal stick. Instead of drawing, she wrote a single word beneath her previous sketch of the anchor, in perfect formal script, remembrance. It was a declaration of trust, the first true intimacy. She was remembering the past, the trauma, and the truth of her purpose. She was choosing to trust the ancient vampire who wore his guilt like a cloak of shadows. Vailin inhaled sharply, his stillness broken by the profound impact of the single word. The internal conflict within him raged, the fear of her power, the guilt of his obligation, now warring with the quiet hope of a shared destiny. He recognized the word. It was a key term in the ancient oaths. She was ready to tell him her story, not with her voice, but with her intent. Chapter 4. The shared secret of her power, the remembrance she had silently offered, deepened the bond between them, transforming their tense isolation into a partnership rooted in high-stakes vulnerability. Valen began to share more, speaking in the careful, measured cadence of a man revealing ancient, painful history. He recounted the full, terrifying scope of the Old War, the betrayal of the first bloodlines, and the covenant he had sworn millennia ago to safeguard the progeny of the Solvats, a duty driven by a profound need to atone for the catastrophic mistakes of his own ancestors. His guilt, which Alara had initially perceived only as a dramatic aura, was now given a name, a date, and a casualty list. He described the political landscape of the present, a powder keg waiting for a spark. The other bloodlines, the ferocious and ambitious Morozovs and the cunning diplomatic Vesperides, were growing restless. The appearance of the Forsaken Covens was not a random attack. It was a test, a probe, confirming the rumors that the Astria house had broken tradition and was sheltering a Solvet's descendant. They believe your blood, special as it is meant to be consumed to bolster their own fading power, Valen explained one night, his hand clenched so tightly on the marble windowsill that the stone dusted faintly under the pressure. They seek the full, unbridled prophecy, the power the anchor unlocks. They seek to use it to resurrect the dread king, the one whose return I swore to prevent. Ilara listened, her silence no longer a lock, but a vessel for his confession. She spent her days poring over the Solvet's texts, the meaning of the ancient languages slowly beginning to resonate in her mind like a forgotten song. She found the section detailing the oath of the silent vessel and drew a picture of it for Valen, two hands clasped in the center of an 8-pointed star, the image radiating immense conviction. Below it, she wrote 2 names, Valen Astria and Alara. Her statement was an offer, a solemn declaration of intent. The central conflict was no longer about trust. It was about the choice they had to make together, to defy ancient politics and survivalist instinct. Valen studied the sketch, his marble features unreadable, his quiet hope warring with the ingrained caution of a man who had lived too long. An oath is eternal, Alara, he warned, his voice a gravelly whisper. It is a chain and a covenant of the soul. My duty is to protect you, yes, but an oath with me is a promise of a life steeped in blood and perpetual siege. He was offering her a chance to retreat, to maintain the distance he had originally imposed, but his tense posture betrayed his deepest need, the need for her to choose him, to choose their shared, burdened path. Her reply was swift and decisive. She took the charcoal and, next to her name, drew a perfect, intricate diagram of the Astria sigil, the mournful moon crescent over a single, stylized drop of blood. She drew it not as a symbol of ownership, but as a visual, binding acceptance of the house and its accompanying high-stakes burden. She looked him in the eye, and the fierce protection she felt for him, this creature of ancient guilt and powerful mercy, was palpable. It was a quiet, desperate hope of a future defined by their loyalty, not their lineage. The air thickened with unspoken vows and the recognition that, in this house of loneliness, they had found a terrifying, intense partnership. Valen finally reached out, his long, cold fingers tentatively tracing the charcoal sigil. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact since the healing, a close-up focus on the symbolic union of their hands, and it felt like the forging of an unbreakable, desperate covenant. Chapter 5. The partnership quickly escalated the stakes. Valen, accepting her silent oath, began training her, though not in combat. He trained her in stillness, in sensory overload, teaching her to control the nascent power that hummed beneath her skin. He made her sit in the coldest parts of the manor, near the drafty windows, forcing her to focus on the sensory information: the cold, the scent of dust and moonlight, the distant, frantic movements of the political world outside their protective shell. He taught her the difference between the natural, slow pace of their life and the sudden, brutal action that marked the attacks of the other covens. "Your power is tied to your emotional state, Alara," he explained, his voice low and intimate, a dramatic contrast to the formal distance he usually maintained. "If you fear, it manifests as a shield of pure destruction. If you are calm, driven by conviction, it is a healing, a binding. Your silence is your control, but it is also a ticking clock. The prophecy states that when the conflict is highest, the silent anchor will speak a single, world-changing word." The thought of her speaking, of releasing the power he knew resided behind her mute lips, caused a visible flicker of apprehension in his eyes, a reflection of the intense tension that underlay their interactions. Their studies often took them to the deepest vaults beneath the manor, chambers carved directly out of the bedrock, smelling strongly of age and sealed power. Here, Valen kept the most dangerous of his relics, the original covenant of the Dread King and the last surviving relics of the Solvats, including a small, smooth stone, the lapis ethel, rumored to amplify the healing touch. As they examined it, Valen was suddenly struck by a moment of intense, crippling guilt. He recoiled from the stone, his marble skin turning faintly gray. He staggered, the weight of centuries of self-hatred suddenly too heavy to bear. "Do you see it?" he muttered, leaning his hand against the cold stone wall, his breathing shallow. "The price of eternity. The stain never fades. Every act of mercy, every choice to protect, is simply another layer of a lie. I am a predator, Ilara. I exist by taking. Even my protection is selfish. It is merely an attempt to balance the scales of my own damnation." His words were full of melancholy, a painful confession revealing the depth of his internal conflict. Ilara moved without hesitation. She did not need words. She simply placed her hand over his on the stone wall. The white, humming heat erupted again, not merely healing a physical wound, but attacking the source of his trauma, the deep, ancient guilt that manifested as a powerful, spiritual wound. Valen let out a soundless groan, his golden eyes snapping open, wide with shock and a terrifying, dawning hope. Her fierce protection was not just for his survival, it was for his soul. When the surge receded, Valen pulled away slowly, staring at his hand, then at her. "That was not healing," he whispered, his voice shaking with a new kind of tension. "That was absolution. That was the power of the covenant in its purest form." He stepped closer, the closeness of his presence a deliberate, intimate threat to the distance they had maintained. He was still the burdened male, but now he was also intimately, terrifyingly hopeful. He reached out a cold, long finger and gently touched the faint silver scar on his side, the site of the original wound. "You have tethered me, Ilara, not with a chain of debt, but with an anchor of choice. We are bound now, heart and legacy." Chapter 6. The binding of their fate catalyzed the external threats. The other bloodlines, having received reports of the powerful, unchecked magic emanating from the Sioux, Astria House interpreted Ilara's presence not as a fragile alliance, but as Valen's attempt to seize control of the prophecy. The Morozovs, known for their sudden, brutal action and siege tactics, struck first. The attack was not stealthy. It was a full-scale assault designed to overwhelm the ancient wards, a display of raw power and high-stakes escalation. The manor, once a sanctuary of cold stillness, became a fortress under siege. The battle began in the deep hours of the night, heralded by a sound that shook the very bedrock, a massive, magical impact against the outer perimeter wards. Valen appeared in Alara's chamber, already clad in his fighting leather, his usual velvet replaced by a dark, supple armor, his beautiful, terrible face set in lines of grim, purposeful action. His golden eyes, fully engaged, were fixed on her. "The Morozovs have come for you, Alara," he stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble, devoid of any melancholy, filled only with the clarity of survival. "They seek to harvest the silent anchor. You will remain here. The wards are strongest around this library vault. Do not touch the lapis ethel. Do not speak. Above all, do not move from the center of the sigil." He was speaking formal combat strategy, but his intent was fiercely protective, a silent declaration that her life was the most valuable asset in the battle. But Alara, driven by her newly forged conviction and a fierce, terrifying protection for him, refused the command. She did not speak, but she moved. She took the lapis ethel from its stand, the small stone warm now in her hand, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. Her eyes met his, and the message was clear. She was not chattel to be guarded, but a partner in the oath. She would be his anchor, his repair, and she would not remain safe while his ancient guilt drove him toward a possible, self-sacrificial death. Valen recognized the refusal, the high-stakes vulnerability of her choice, and his internal conflict was evident, a flash of pride battling the immediate, terrifying fear for her safety. He swore under his breath, a curse in an ancient, forgotten tongue. "If you leave this room, you become a participant in the old war," he warned her one last time, his hand hovering over the hilt of his weapon, a massive, elegantly curved sword of blackened silver. She responded by extending her hand, palm up, a silent, intimate declaration. It was a request for the blade, a demand to be acknowledged as his equal in this desperate, high-stakes moment. Valen did not give her the sword, but he did something more profound. He took her hand, his cold fingers closing over hers, their contact a brief, intense discharge of their combined power. The white heat flared around them for a split second, visible even in the dim light, reinforcing their covenant. He released her, his eyes shining with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. "Then you will stay close to me, close enough that I can anchor you if the Morozovs try to breach your silence. Do not move unless I command it. This is not a game, Alara. This is the death of history." He turned then, his movement a sudden liquid grace as he moved from the library into the siege, a figure of dark academia in a world of brutal, supernatural combat. Alara, the silent girl with the reawakened legacy, followed, her terror overridden by a profound, lonely hope. Chapter 7. The siege of the Astria House was a sensory overload of brutal action and supernatural threat. The fighting was confined mainly to the Grand Hall and the exterior grounds, keeping the inner sanctum of the library relatively intact, though the air vibrated with the constant percussion of magical impacts and the horrifying animalistic snarls of the Morozov warriors. Alara moved through the periphery, her stillness and silence a counterpoint to the chaotic violence. She stayed close to Valen, a phantom tethered to a shadow, her hand hovering near the pocket where the lapis ethel resided, focusing her immense conviction. Valen was a terrifying, beautiful weapon. His movements were a study in purposeful, efficient combat. No wasted motion, only the swift, crushing blows of a warrior who had fought this war countless times before. He moved through the Morozov ranks like a dark current, the blackened silver sword a blur of lethal grace. He fought with the self-loathing intensity of a creature seeking absolution through defense, his self-hatred fueling his powerful mercy. He was protecting Alara, yes, but he was also punishing himself for the ancient guilt. At one point, a Morozov warrior, faster and more cunning than the rest, managed to slip past Valen's guard and rush Alara. The creature was monstrous, its features blurred by speed, its claws tipped with a venomous, sickly green glow. Alara froze, the terror of the moment threatening to shatter her control and release the destructive aspect of her power. Valen, seeing the threat, let out a guttural, terrifying roar, a sound she had not known his kind could make. He launched himself forward, a final, desperate burst of liquid grace, placing his own body between her and the attack. The Morozov struck, not at the vampire's heart, but at his shoulder, an immense, tearing wound that sprayed dark blood across the marble floor. Valen staggered, his defenses momentarily broken, the pain in his golden eyes a raw, terrifying thing. The creature raised its claws for the killing blow. Alara reacted instantly. All thoughts of silence and caution vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, fierce protection and overwhelming, lonely hope for the creature who had chosen her life over his own. She lunged forward, not toward the Morozov, but toward Valen's wound, her hand pressing firmly against the tear in his shoulder. She activated the lapis ethel, the small stone in her pocket radiating a blinding heat. The white light that erupted from her was not a gentle pulse. It was an explosion, a sensory overload of pure, concentrated power. It was the full, unbridled legacy of the Solvats. The Morozov warrior didn't just recoil, it was instantly vaporized, turning into a pile of ash that dissipated on the cold marble floor. Valen's wound snapped shut, the muscle and tissue knitting themselves together with a deafening speed. He felt the familiar, spiritual absolution, but this time it was too much, too violent. He collapsed to one knee, overwhelmed by the power of the silent anchor. Alara, trembling, her own face pale, remained standing over him, her eyes wide, realizing the true devastating scale of the power she possessed. The fierce protection had turned into an act of terrifying, near-fatal mercy. As the remaining Morozovs, terrified by the instantaneous, clean vaporization of their comrade, began to retreat, Valen slowly rose. He looked at Alara, not with fear, but with a complex mixture of reverence and profound, high-stakes concern. "You released it," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his formal facade completely stripped away. "You unleashed the power of the prophecy." The silence of the manor returned, thick and tense, but now it was the silence of anticipation. The climax of the siege was over, but the climax of their story, the moment of the word, was yet to come. Chapter 8. The fragile victory came at a profound cost. The Morozovs retreated, not defeated, but terrified by the unbridled power Alara had unleashed. The manor, however, was scarred, its Gothic beauty marred by scorch marks and the residual taint of dark magic. The sudden, brutal action had subsided, forcing a return to a slow-burn, atmospheric tension. Valen led Alara back to the library, his movements slower, more deliberate, the recent trauma evident even on his marble skin. He sat her down by the remnants of the fire, his golden eyes never leaving her face. The formality was gone, replaced by an intimate, raw vulnerability. "The Morozovs will return, but they will not be alone," he stated, his voice a low, heavy sound. "The sheer power you showed, the vaporization, will draw the attention of the Vesperides. They are far more dangerous, masters of political thriller and ancient oaths, not brute force. They will try to manipulate you, to force the world word from your lips." He spoke then of the ultimate, terrifying stakes of the prophecy of the silent anchor. He explained that her silence was not just a lock on destructive power, it was a necessary constraint on a word so potent it could literally rewrite the covenants of the universe, either restoring the ancient peace or freeing the dread king. "If you speak that word prematurely, if it is forced from you by fear or manipulation, the consequences will be cataclysmic," he warned, his own internal conflict, his duty to the world versus his desire to protect her, starkly visible. Alara listened, her face a pale mask of melancholy and intense conviction. She was driven by a guilt of her own, the guilt of possessing a power so terrible, a power that had just vaporized a living creature. She reached into her pocket and placed the lapis ethol on the marble hearth between them, a silent admission of her own terror and the burden of her legacy. She then took the charcoal, not to sketch, but to write. She wrote a philosophical question, rooted in their shared conflict. If my protection of you requires the destruction of another, is it mercy or simply a choice of victim? Valen looked at the words, the question a stark reflection of his own centuries-long self-hatred. He understood the subtext. She was asking if her fierce protection of him was leading her down his own path of blood and guilt. He reached out and gently took the charcoal stick from her hand, his fingers brushing hers, a close-up focus on the shared vulnerability of the moment. "It is choice, Elara," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, an intense declaration of his own moral compass. "Mercy is the absence of choice. We do not have that luxury. We choose who we protect, and for what purpose. I choose to protect the world through you. I choose to protect you above all else, even the sanctity of my own soul. It is a selfish choice, born of profound loneliness, but it is mine, and now it is yours." He looked directly into her eyes, his intense gaze unwavering. "The Vesperides will arrive soon. They will use diplomacy, not claws. They will offer you escape, freedom, a life without the burden of the prophecy. They will use your guilt against you, painting me as the architect of your trauma. You must be prepared to make your final choice, and you must not speak unless you choose your purpose first." The intimate tension in the air was suffocating, the true test of their covenant quickly approaching. Chapter 9. The arrival of the Vesperides was an elegant, chilling contrast to the brutal action of the Morozov siege. Their emissary, Lady Solstice, arrived not with battle gear, but with a diplomatic entourage, draped in silk and emanating a false warmth that did nothing to hide the core of their political ambition. She was the personification of dark academia, cunning, beautiful, and utterly ruthless, using sparse, formal language to convey maximum threat. The meeting took place in the repaired Grand Hall, a setting of enforced grandeur and high-stakes negotiation. Valen stood beside Elara, a silent, powerful monument of fierce protection. His posture spoke volumes, but it was his complete control over his emotional tone, a mask of profound distance that truly unnerved the Vesperide delegation. Lady Solstice addressed Elara directly, completely ignoring Valen, a calculated move to isolate the silent anchor. "Child, your contract with the Astria House is nullified by the activation of the Solvate's legacy. Lord Astria has bound you here out of selfishness, clinging to the remnants of an old covenant built on blood and guilt. We, the Vesperides, offer you freedom. We offer you a life without the burden of prophecy, a choice to abandon the old war. You need only agree to break the covenant you have silently forged with the one who wears his guilt like a cloak." She struck at the heart of Elara's internal conflict, her need for safety battling her overwhelming protective conviction for Valen. She spoke of the trauma, the loneliness, the violence, all of which Valen had indeed brought into Elara's life. "You do not owe him the price of your destiny. He is a predator, and his protection is merely a means to an end. Speak now, and you will be free. Speak and tell us you choose life, not the embrace of eternal death." Valen remained silent, his intense stillness a testament to the trust he had finally placed in Elara. He would not argue for her. He would not force her. This was the moment of choice, the final test of their covenant, a high-stakes vulnerability that required her to choose him, guilt and all. His eyes, usually golden pools of melancholic despair, were now fixed on her, quietly hopeful, waiting for the one response that mattered. Elara felt the immense pressure of the moment, the sensory overload of the political drama. She thought of Valen's confessions, his self-hatred, the silver scar her power had etched onto his skin, and the terrifying, intimate absolution she had given him. She looked at the Vesperide delegation, the cunning eyes, the false mercy, and knew that their offer was merely another, more elegant form of consumption. She stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and full of immense conviction. She reached into her pocket, not for the lapis ethel, but for the crumpled piece of charcoal-stained paper from the previous night, the paper where she had written her philosophical question. She smoothed it out on the table, her hands shaking slightly. Then she looked at Valen, her eyes holding his in an intimate, powerful declaration of intent. She opened her mouth, a gesture that immediately caused a ripple of anticipation and fear among the delegates. For the first time since the prophetess was burned, the silent anchor chose to speak. Her voice, when it came, was a low, clear, resonant sound, formal and carrying the weight of the ages, the ultimate dialogue line. It was not the world word, but it was the word of her final choice. Chapter 10. The single word, spoken for the first time in 4 years, hung in the grand hall, shattering the tense silence and freezing the Vesperide delegation in a state of profound shock. Alara had not chosen a complex philosophical phrase or a word from the ancient languages and terminology. She had chosen a simple, devastating, and entirely personal word, a declaration of trust and intent that was the final, indelible seal on their covenant. Anchor. The word echoed, resonant and clear, and immediately the white humming power erupted from her again. But this time it was not destructive. It was a binding, a massive wave of pure, concentrated energy. The true legacy of the Solvats swept through the chamber, not harming the Vesperides, but magically reinforcing every single ward, oath, and covenant Valen Astria had ever sworn. The very foundations of the Astria house groaned under the strain of the powerful, world-changing magic. The Vesperide emissary, Lady Solstice, stumbled back, her mask of cunning diplomacy dissolving into a look of raw, unadulterated fear. The prophecy, you have chosen him, you have chosen the guilt, she hissed, the accusation rooted in the irony of the situation. Alara had chosen the tormented guardian over the false freedom. Valen did not move, but the change in him was absolute. The weight of his ancient guilt, the burden of self-hatred seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a terrible, fierce lightness. The word anchor had not just bound her to him, it had bound him to her, solidifying his role as her fierce protector and her source of powerful mercy. He was no longer fighting for absolution. He was fighting for choice. The covenant is sealed, Valen stated, his voice now a low, unshakable declaration of power and immense conviction. His golden eyes, fully engaged, were fixed on the retreating Vesperides. The silent anchor has spoken her intent. She is of this house. She is my choice, and I am hers. You will retreat, or I will consider the siege renewed, and the next act of my mercy will be less restrained. He moved toward Alara, his movement a stunning combination of liquid grace and purposeful action, drawing her into the protective orbit of his dark velvet coat. The Vesperides, realizing the political thriller had just ended in an unbreakable supernatural romance, retreated quickly, their mission a failure. The manor descended back into silence, but it was a new silence, no longer lonely, but deeply intimate and tense with the promise of the future. Alara leaned into Valen's stillness, her exhaustion absolute, the immense strain of speaking and of the power drain nearly overwhelming. She had chosen the burden, the loneliness, the blood, and the high-stakes political conflict, all for the burdened male who wore his guilt so beautifully. Valen held her close, a close-up focus on the contact between his marble skin and her warm, human form. He was the ancient relic, she the reawakened power, but now they were simply two beings, anchored to each other's trauma and hope. He whispered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. I cannot promise you peace, Alara. I can only promise you that every breath I take will be used to protect the choice you have made. You are the anchor. You are my remembrance. Alara did not speak again, conserving the immense power the world word demanded. Instead, she lifted her hand and, with a trembling finger, traced the silver scar on his shoulder, her intimate, powerful confirmation that the covenant of remembrance was eternal and that their shared destiny was just beginning. The moon, their eternal witness, cast long, stark shadows over the house of mourning, illuminating the silent, fiercely protective vampire and the silent, fiercely hopeful girl, two figures standing against the coming storm.